Behind the galactic adventure that changed cinema forever lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets, casting mishaps and unexpected disasters. From Peter Cushing wearing carpet slippers while destroying Alderaan to Tunisia's first rainstorm in 50 years striking the film set, the making of Star Wars was filled with absurd moments that could have derailed the entire franchise. Fact 1. Grand Moff Tarkin destroyed Alderaan while wearing slippers. When audiences first witnessed the terrifying Grand Moff Tarkin order the destruction of Princess Leia's home planet in 1977, they had no idea that the actor behind this cold-blooded Imperial commander was actually wearing cozy carpet slippers. Peter Cushing, the distinguished British actor who portrayed the Death Star's ruthless commander, faced an unexpected wardrobe crisis that led to one of the most amusing behind-the-scenes stories in Star Wars history. The problem began when Cushing arrived on set and discovered that the costume department hadn't prepared boots in his size. As a man with notably large feet, measuring size 12, Cushing frequently encountered this issue in film productions where custom footwear was needed. The stock Imperial boots provided for his character were painfully tight and made walking around the set an agonizing experience. After spending his first day of filming stomping around in genuine discomfort, Cushing knew he had to find a solution. The next day, Cushing approached director George Lucas with a simple request that would become legendary among Star Wars fans. He asked if Lucas could film him primarily from the waist up so he could wear his comfortable carpet slippers instead of the torturous boots. Lucas, always practical about solving production problems, readily agreed to this arrangement. From that point forward, whenever Grand Moff Tarkin appeared on screen delivering his menacing orders or coldly observing the Death Star's operations, Peter Cushing was wearing soft, comfortable slippers on his feet. Cushing later described the experience with characteristic humor, explaining how he spent the rest of the production stomping around looking extremely angry and very cross with that dear little Carrie Fisher as Grand Moff Tarkin in carpet slippers. He noted that viewers should pay attention to how rarely his feet appeared in the final film, joking that when they did, people should realize the torture he would have been going through in those ill-fitting boots. The costume department even created a miniature pair of slippers for Cushing's 12-inch action figure as a playful tribute to this memorable production story. Fact 2. Tunisia's first major rainstorm in 50 years hit the film set. When George Lucas chose the deserts of Tunisia to represent the fictional planet Tatooine, he expected nothing but endless sunshine and perfect weather for filming his space epic. What he got instead was a meteorological miracle that nearly derailed the entire production before it really began. On just the second day of shooting in March 1976, Tunisia experienced its first major rainstorm in 50 years, turning what should have been a dry desert landscape into a soggy, muddy mess that made filming impossible. The timing couldn't have been worse for the already tight production schedule. Lucas had allocated only 11 days to complete all the crucial Tatooine scenes, including Luke Skywalker's introduction and the memorable moments with the droids wandering through the desert. The unexpected downpour completely washed out an entire day of filming, putting immediate pressure on a production that was already struggling with malfunctioning equipment and other technical difficulties. Cinematographer Gilbert Taylor later described the surreal scene, explaining that the rain created such poor visibility that you couldn't tell where the land ended and the sky began. Everything appeared as a gray, blurry mess, and the robots were barely visible through the downpour. The storm was so rare and unexpected that even the local Tunisian crew members were caught completely off guard by the weather phenomenon. The production team had specifically chosen Tunisia because of its reliably dry climate and dramatic desert landscapes that would perfectly capture the harsh, arid environment of Luke's home planet. The country's location next to the Sahara Desert typically guaranteed the kind of clear skies and bright sunshine that Lucas needed for his outdoor scenes. Instead, the crew found themselves waiting helplessly as the first significant rainfall in half a century turned their carefully planned desert shoot into an unpredictable weather disaster. This freak storm was just the beginning of the production troubles that would plague the Star Wars crew throughout their time in Tunisia. But it certainly set the tone for what would become one of the most challenging film shoots in movie history, where even the weather seemed determined to work against the creation of the galaxy far, far away. Fact 3. Harrison Ford was only hired to read lines to other actors. Harrison Ford's journey to becoming Han Solo began not with an audition, but with what was essentially a favor for his former director. When George Lucas started casting for Star Wars in 1975, he had already worked with Ford on American Graffiti and was determined to find completely fresh faces for his space opera. Lucas specifically didn't want to cast actors he had worked with before, believing that audiences needed to see new performers in these iconic roles. However, Ford found himself back in Lucas's orbit through an unexpected twist of fate. At the time, Ford was struggling financially as an actor and had taken up carpentry work to pay the bills. Producer Fred Roos hired Ford to install a door at American Zoetrope, the same building where Lucas was conducting his Star Wars auditions. When Lucas spotted Ford working on the construction project, they exchanged pleasantries, but Lucas remained firm about not considering him for any roles in the film. Instead, a producer asked Ford if he would help with the casting process by reading lines with the actors who were auditioning for various parts. Ford agreed to this behind-the-scenes role, not knowing it would change his entire career. His job was to sit across from potential Luke Skywalkers, Princess Leia's, and Han Solo's, delivering dialogue so the auditioning actors would have someone to play off during their screen tests. But Ford didn't just read the lines in a flat, mechanical way. He brought his own interpretation to the smuggler character, infusing Han Solo with the perfect blend of cocky swagger and world-weary cynicism that would define the role. As Ford worked with actor after actor during the 7-month casting process, Lucas began to notice something remarkable happening during these sessions. Lucas later admitted that when he watched the screen tests back, comparing Ford's line readings with the actual auditioners, there was simply no question about who was the best fit for Han Solo. Ford's natural charisma and his instinctive understanding of the character's roguish charm won over the director, leading Lucas to abandon his original plan and offer Ford the role that would make him a household name. Fact 4. Alec Guinness called Star Wars fairy tale rubbish. The distinguished British actor Sir Alec Guinness, who would become beloved by millions as the wise Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi, had a very different opinion of Star Wars while he was making it. In private letters to his close friend Anne Kaufman, Guinness expressed his true feelings about George Lucas's space opera, dismissing it as nothing more than fairy tale rubbish and complaining bitterly about what he considered to be terrible writing. When Guinness first received the script offer in 1975, he was initially hesitant about taking on a science fiction project. In one letter to Kaufman, he wrote about being offered a movie by 20th Century Fox that he might accept if they came up with proper money, describing it as science fiction, which gave him pause. He admitted that the story seemed like fairy tale rubbish, but acknowledged it could potentially be interesting, showing his mixed feelings about the project from the very beginning. Once filming began, Guinness's attitude didn't improve much. He continued writing to his friend, expressing his frustration with the constant script changes and poor dialogue. He complained that new rubbish dialogue reached him every other day on pages of pink paper, and none of it made his character clear or even bearable to play. Despite these harsh criticisms, Guinness admitted he was thinking thankfully of the lovely money he would earn, which would help him keep going financially. The veteran actor's dissatisfaction wasn't limited to the script quality. He also felt overwhelmed by the younger cast members, writing that Mark Hamill and the other actors made him feel 90 years old and treated him as if he was 106. Guinness took the role primarily because 20th Century Fox had doubled his original salary offer to $300,000, plus an additional 2% of the film's profits, making it a financially attractive proposition despite his artistic reservations about the material. Ironically, despite calling it rubbish during production, Guinness's portrayal of Obi-Wan Kenobi earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor and became one of his most memorable and financially rewarding roles. Fact 5. The famous opening crawl was filmed using 2-foot black paper. The iconic opening text crawl that appears at the beginning of Star Wars was created using surprisingly simple and old-fashioned techniques that required no computer graphics whatsoever. Instead of relying on digital effects that didn't exist in 1977, the filmmakers had to build physical models and use careful camera work to achieve the famous effect that audiences have come to associate with every Star Wars film. The process began with creating large pieces of black paper that measured 2 feet wide and 6 feet long, with the opening text printed in yellow letters across the dark surface. These paper models were then laid flat on the floor of the studio, creating what essentially looked like giant pieces of poster board with the movie's introduction written out in full. The production team had to create multiple versions of these text boards to accommodate different language translations for international releases. To capture the distinctive crawling effect, the camera operators positioned a special motor-controlled camera very low to the ground, almost at floor level with the paper models. The camera was then programmed to move slowly along the length of the text at a carefully calculated speed that would create the illusion of words disappearing into space when the film was played back at normal speed. Visual effects artist Dennis Murin explained that the camera ran at a very slow speed during filming, but this allowed for pretty fast motions when the footage was played back at regular speed. The biggest challenge was achieving perfect alignment and avoiding any visible imperfections during what became a 2,000-frame-long continuous shot. Every little blemish, bump, or slight movement of the camera would show up clearly in the final film, making this seemingly simple effect actually one of the most difficult and nerve-wracking sequences to shoot. The crew had to run through countless test shots and spend days getting everything lined up just right. Ken Ralston, who worked on the later films, described shooting the opening crawl as pure torture because of how precise everything had to be, even though it was also fun to create such an iconic piece of cinema history using such basic materials. Fact 6. C-3PO and R2-D2 actors had a decades-long feud. While C-3PO and R2-D2 shared one of cinema's most beloved friendships on screen, the actors who brought these droids to life couldn't stand each other in real life. Anthony Daniels, who performed both the voice and body movements for the Golden Protocol droid, and Kenny Baker, who operated R2-D2 from inside the robot's shell, carried on a bitter personal feud that lasted for decades and became one of the worst-kept secrets in Hollywood. The animosity between the two actors became public knowledge in 2005 when Kenny Baker gave a particularly harsh interview about his co-star. Baker, who stood 3 feet 8 inches tall and had worked in vaudeville and circus performances before Star Wars, described Daniels as someone who never wanted to socialize with the cast and crew. Baker recounted a specific incident where he tried to say hello to Daniels, only to have the C-3PO actor turn his back and rudely tell him he couldn't see that Daniels was having a conversation, even though no one else was around. Baker didn't hold back in his criticism, calling Daniels the rudest man he had ever met, and expressing his frustration that they could have made a fortune touring together and making personal appearances if Daniels had been willing to work with him. The R2-D2 actor also revealed that Daniels had been calling him Little Man for 30 years, a nickname that Baker absolutely hated and found deeply insulting. For his part, Anthony Daniels seemed genuinely puzzled by the ongoing conflict and rarely addressed Baker's complaints directly in interviews. When he did speak about their working relationship, Daniels explained that they had very different schedules on set, with him needing an hour to get into his C-3PO costume, while Baker could slip into R2-D2 in just 5 minutes. Daniels also noted that once they were both in their robot costumes, they couldn't see or hear each other, making any real communication impossible during filming. The feud continued right up until Baker's death in 2016, when Daniels posted a notably brief and formal tribute on social media. Fact 7. James Earl Jones recorded Vader's voice in just 2.5 hours. One of the most iconic villain voices in cinema history was created in remarkably little time, with James Earl Jones completing all of Darth Vader's dialogue for the entire original Star Wars film in a single recording session that lasted just 2.5 hours. This incredibly efficient performance took place on March 1st, 1977, just 2 months before the movie hit theaters, at Goldwyn Studios in Hollywood. Jones was brought into the project because George Lucas felt that David Prowse's natural British accent didn't match the menacing presence that Darth Vader was supposed to project. Prowse, who physically performed in the Vader costume throughout filming, had been speaking his lines on set, but Lucas knew from the beginning that the voice would need to be replaced in post-production to achieve the right intimidating effect for the character. The recording process was surprisingly straightforward and businesslike. Jones, who was experiencing one of his periodic stretches of unemployment as an actor, was simply happy to have a day's work when his agent called about the voiceover job. He had no idea he was about to create one of the most recognizable voices in movie history, and neither did anyone else involved in the production at that time. For his brief but legendary performance, Jones received $7,000, which was a decent day's pay in 1977, but would prove to be a bargain considering the cultural impact his voice would have. Jones later admitted that nobody connected with the film knew it would become the massive cultural phenomenon it eventually became, and he was simply grateful to be part of what seemed like an interesting science fiction project. The technique Jones and Lucas developed for Vader's voice was to keep it within very strict boundaries of inflection, creating a character who never displayed the beauties and subtleties of normal human expression. Jones deliberately held back his natural acting instincts, creating a voice that suggested a man who had lost touch with his humanity, which perfectly matched the character's tragic backstory that would be revealed in later films. Fact 8. Orson Welles was originally considered for Darth Vader's voice. Before James Earl Jones became the legendary voice of Darth Vader, George Lucas had his sights set on one of the most famous voices in entertainment history. Orson Welles, the legendary filmmaker and actor behind Citizen Kane and the infamous War of the Worlds radio broadcast, was Lucas's first choice to provide the menacing vocal performance for the Dark Lord of the Sith. Welles possessed exactly the kind of deep, commanding voice that Lucas envisioned for his primary villain. The acclaimed actor and director had already established himself as one of the most distinctive voices in Hollywood, with a rich baritone that could convey both authority and menace. His theatrical background and dramatic training made him seem like the perfect candidate to bring gravitas and fear to the masked character who would serve as the film's main antagonist. However, Lucas ultimately decided against pursuing Welles for the role because of the very quality that made him so appealing in the first place. The director realized that Welles's voice was simply too recognizable to audiences who had been hearing it in films and on radio for decades. Lucas was concerned that moviegoers would immediately think, "That's Orson Welles," instead of being completely immersed in the character of Darth Vader, which would break the spell of the science fiction fantasy he was trying to create. This decision led Lucas to seek out a voice that would be equally powerful and intimidating, but not instantly identifiable to the general public. James Earl Jones later reflected on this casting process, explaining that Lucas probably thought Orson Welles might be too recognizable. So he ended up picking a voice that was born in Mississippi, raised in Michigan, and belonged to someone who had overcome a childhood stutter. The choice ultimately proved to be brilliant, as Jones created a voice that became inseparable from the character without audiences being distracted by the actor's previous work. Interestingly, Welles died in 1985, just 2 years after Return of the Jedi was released, which would have made it impossible for him to continue voicing Vader throughout the entire original trilogy, even if he had been chosen. Fact 9. Lucas wanted Japanese actor Toshiro Mifune as Obi-Wan Kenobi. George Lucas's original vision for Obi-Wan Kenobi looked very different from the wise British mentor that audiences came to know and love. Heavily inspired by the samurai films of legendary Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, Lucas initially wanted to cast Toshiro Mifune, the iconic star of classics like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, as the Jedi Master who would guide Luke Skywalker on his heroic journey. The connection between Lucas's space opera and Japanese cinema ran much deeper than most fans realize. Lucas had based many elements of Star Wars directly on Kurosawa's 1958 film The Hidden Fortress, borrowing its story structure and even some specific scenes. The parallels between Jedi Knights and samurai warriors were obvious to Lucas, who saw the Force as similar to the spiritual discipline that guided Japan's legendary swordmasters. Mifune was the perfect embodiment of everything Lucas admired about samurai culture and Kurosawa's filmmaking. The distinguished actor had starred in over a dozen Kurosawa films and was widely regarded as one of the greatest performers in Japanese cinema history. His intense screen presence and natural authority made him seem like an ideal choice to play the mentor figure who would introduce audiences to the mystical ways of the Jedi. However, when Lucas approached Mifune through intermediaries, the veteran actor politely declined the offer. According to his daughter Mika Mifune, who revealed this story at a Tokyo event in 2015, her father was concerned about how the film would look and worried that appearing in a science fiction movie would cheapen the image of samurai culture. At the time, science fiction films were known for having relatively cheap special effects and low production values, and Mifune had too much pride in the samurai tradition to risk being associated with something that might look silly or undignified. Mifune's concerns were understandable given the state of science fiction cinema in the mid-1970s, but his decision meant that audiences never got to see what would have been a fascinating interpretation of the Obi-Wan character from one of cinema's most respected actors. Fact 10. The Sandcrawler nearly started a real war. The massive Sandcrawler vehicle that housed the Jawas in Star Wars came dangerously close to triggering an actual military conflict between two North African nations during filming in 1976. The enormous prop, which was designed to look like a giant mobile fortress crawling across the desert landscape, caught the attention of Libyan border guards who mistook it for a real military vehicle and reported it as a potential threat to their government. The political situation in the region was already extremely tense when the Star Wars crew arrived in Tunisia to film the desert planet scenes. Libya, ruled by the unpredictable dictator Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, had particularly strained relations with its neighbor Tunisia. Just as filming began in March 1976, Libya had expelled thousands of Tunisian workers from the country, and tensions were running high along the border between the two nations. To make matters worse, Gaddafi was feeling especially paranoid following a failed coup attempt against his government the previous year, making him suspicious of any unusual activity near Libya's borders. When Libyan military scouts spotted what appeared to be a massive, armored vehicle moving around in the Tunisian desert near their shared border, they immediately reported it to their superiors as a possible military provocation. The sandcrawler, which had been constructed by the film crew over 8 weeks in the southwestern Tunisian town of Tozeur, was indeed an impressive and intimidating sight. The enormous vehicle was designed to look like a mobile fortress that could traverse harsh desert terrain, and from a distance through binoculars or surveillance equipment, it could easily be mistaken for some kind of experimental military hardware. Colonel Gaddafi was reportedly furious when he received reports about this mysterious vehicle and demanded that Tunisia immediately explain what he viewed as hostile military provocations along their shared border. The situation became serious enough that George Lucas was forced to move the sandcrawler to a less provocative location away from the Libyan border to avoid any further diplomatic incidents. The production team managed to complete their filming without triggering an international crisis, though the incident highlighted just how realistic their movie props had turned out to be. Fact 11. Guinness couldn't remember Harrison Ford's name. Despite working closely with Harrison Ford during the filming of Star Wars, the distinguished actor Sir Alec Guinness seemed to have an ongoing struggle with remembering his younger co-star's actual name. In the private letters that Guinness wrote to his friend Anne Kaufman from the movie set, he repeatedly got Ford's name wrong in amusing and creative ways that revealed just how disconnected he felt from the entire production. In one particularly entertaining letter, Guinness wrote about having to work with Mark Hamill and someone he called Tennyson Ford, apparently confusing Harrison's first name with that of the famous British poet Alfred Lord Tennyson. He then seemed to catch himself and tried again, writing Ellison with a question mark, as if he knew that wasn't quite right either, but couldn't remember the correct name. Eventually, Guinness gave up on trying to get Ford's name right and simply described him as a rangy, languid young man who was probably intelligent and amusing. This description actually captured Ford's screen presence quite well, even if Guinness couldn't manage to remember what to call him. The veteran British actor did eventually figure out the correct name, adding at the end of his letter, "Oh, Harrison Ford, ever heard of him?" in a tone that suggested he had no idea Ford would become one of Hollywood's biggest stars. These name mix-ups were part of a larger pattern of confusion and disconnection that Guinness experienced throughout the Star Wars production. The classically trained actor, who was used to working on prestigious theatrical productions and serious dramatic films, seemed genuinely bewildered by the science fiction setting and the young American cast members he was working alongside. The fact that Guinness couldn't keep track of Ford's name becomes even more amusing when you consider that Ford would go on to become one of the most recognizable actors in the world, starring not only in the Star Wars sequels, but also in the Indiana Jones franchise and numerous other blockbuster films that made him a household name for decades to come. Fact 12. Lucas originally planned all Japanese or all-black casts. Before settling on the diverse but predominantly white cast that audiences came to know, George Lucas seriously entertained several dramatically different casting approaches that would have completely changed the look and feel of Star Wars. During the early development stages of the film, Lucas explored the possibility of using entire casts made up of actors from specific ethnic backgrounds or physical characteristics, each of which would have created a vastly different version of his space opera. The most developed of these alternative casting ideas was Lucas's plan for an all-Japanese cast, which grew directly out of his deep admiration for the films of Akira Kurosawa. This concept would have featured Toshiro Mifune, not just as Obi-Wan Kenobi, but as part of a completely Japanese ensemble that would have emphasized the samurai influences that inspired the Jedi mythology. Lucas felt that using Japanese actors throughout the film would have been the most authentic way to honor the Eastern philosophical and martial arts traditions that formed the foundation of his story. Lucas also gave serious consideration to casting the entire film with black actors, which would have been a groundbreaking decision in 1970s Hollywood and would have created a science fiction epic unlike anything audiences had ever seen. This approach would have addressed the lack of diversity in major studio films while creating a unique visual and cultural identity for his galaxy far, far away. Perhaps the most unusual casting concept that Lucas explored was the idea of using an all-little-people cast throughout the film. This concept was reportedly influenced by his love of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books, where hobbits and other smaller characters played central roles in an epic fantasy adventure. Lucas apparently felt that using actors of shorter stature could create a distinctive fairy tale quality that would set his space fantasy apart from other science fiction films of the era. Each of these casting approaches would have resulted in a completely different Star Wars experience, and it's fascinating to imagine how the cultural impact and reception of the film might have changed if Lucas had followed through with any of these bold and unconventional ideas. Fact 13. The film's title was originally much longer and weirder. The movie that became simply known as Star Wars originally had one of the most unwieldy and bizarre titles in Hollywood history. When George Lucas was working on his second draft of the script, he gave his space opera the incredibly long and convoluted title The Adventures of Luke Starkiller, as taken from The Journey of the Whills, which would have been nearly impossible to fit on a movie poster or theater marquee. This original title reveals just how different Lucas's early vision was from the streamlined story that eventually made it to theaters. The name Luke Starkiller sounds much more aggressive and violent than the heroic Luke Skywalker that audiences came to love, suggesting that Lucas initially imagined his main character as someone with a much darker edge. The Starkiller name implied a protagonist who might be more ruthless or militaristic in his approach to fighting the evil empire. The second part of the original title, referring to the Journey of the Whills, pointed to an elaborate mythology that Lucas had developed but never fully explained in the finished film. The Whills were apparently some kind of cosmic beings or ancient chroniclers who were recording the events of the galaxy for posterity, making the entire Star Wars saga just one story from their vast collection of galactic histories. Lucas seemed to envision his space opera as part of a much larger and more complex universe filled with mysterious spiritual entities and cosmic forces that went far beyond the relatively simple good versus evil story that eventually emerged. The overly complicated title suggested that Lucas was thinking of his film more like an epic literary work or historical chronicle, rather than the accessible adventure movie that would appeal to mainstream audiences. Fortunately for everyone involved, Lucas eventually simplified both the title and the story, dropping the confusing references to the Whills and changing Luke's surname from the harsh-sounding Starkiller to the more poetic and hopeful Skywalker. The final title of simply Star Wars was clean, memorable, and perfectly captured the space adventure that Lucas had created without getting bogged down in unnecessary mystical complications. Fact 14. Anthony Daniels' C-3PO costume broke and injured him. Playing the Golden Protocol droid, C-3PO turned out to be more dangerous than Anthony Daniels ever expected when a piece of his elaborate costume literally broke apart and stabbed him in the foot during filming in the Tunisian desert. The incident occurred during the early days of production, when Daniels was still getting used to moving around in the bulky, restrictive costume that would define his career for decades to come. The C-3PO costume was an incredibly complex piece of engineering that required Daniels to wear multiple layers of fiberglass and plastic components that were fitted together around his body. The golden suit was not only heavy and uncomfortable, but it also severely limited his movement and vision, making every step a careful calculation to avoid falling or damaging the expensive costume pieces. During one particularly challenging day of filming in the harsh desert conditions, the left leg section of Daniel's costume suddenly shattered without warning. A sharp piece of the broken fiberglass broke away from the main structure and pierced through to stab Daniels directly in his foot, causing a genuine injury that required immediate medical attention from the production's on-set medical team. The accident highlighted just how physically demanding and potentially hazardous it was for Daniels to perform in the C-3PO suit, especially under the extreme conditions of the Tunisian desert, where temperatures soared during the day and equipment was constantly being stressed by sand, heat, and the challenges of outdoor filming. The costume had not been designed with the kind of durability needed for extensive location shooting in harsh environments. The injury forced a temporary halt in filming while Daniels received treatment, and the costume department worked to repair and reinforce the damaged sections of the C-3PO suit. The incident also led to modifications in how the costume was constructed and maintained throughout the rest of the production, as everyone realized that the safety of the actor inside was just as important as the visual appearance of the beloved droid character that audiences would eventually come to adore. Fact 15. Lucas nearly died from stress during production. The making of Star Wars literally almost killed its creator, as George Lucas became so overwhelmed by the constant problems and setbacks during filming that he developed serious health issues that required immediate medical intervention. The stress of managing what seemed like an impossible production took such a severe toll on Lucas's body that doctors warned him he was putting his life at risk if he didn't find ways to reduce the pressure he was under. Lucas was diagnosed with hypertension and complete physical exhaustion as the production disasters continued to mount during filming. The 29-year-old director was dealing with equipment failures in the Tunisian desert, conflicts with the British crew at Elstree Studios who didn't respect his authority, budget overruns that threatened to shut down the entire project, and the constant worry that his ambitious special effects sequences wouldn't be ready in time for the film's release date. The situation became so dire that 20th Century Fox actually ran out of money and had to halt production for 2 full weeks until studio executives could approve an additional $3 million in funding to complete the film. During this terrifying period, Lucas was not only facing the possible collapse of his dream project, but also dealing with the knowledge that his career might be over if Star Wars failed at the box office. The combination of creative pressure, financial stress, and physical exhaustion from working impossibly long hours finally caught up with Lucas when medical professionals told him that his stress levels had reached dangerous heights. His doctors made it clear that he needed to take immediate steps to reduce his workload and find ways to manage his anxiety, or he could face serious long-term health consequences that might affect the rest of his life. The irony was that Lucas was pushing himself to the breaking point while creating what would become one of the most successful and beloved films in cinema history. He had no way of knowing that all the suffering and stress he was enduring would ultimately result in a cultural phenomenon that would make him one of the most successful filmmakers in Hollywood and secure his legacy for generations to come. Generations to come. Generations to come. Generations.